Hello and welcome to Weapons and Warfare from Straight Arrow News. I'm Ryan Robertson, and this is the debut of our weekly look at what's happening in the worlds of, weapons and warfare. On the show, we'll dive into stories of national defense as well as conflicts from around the world. So let's start this week in Gaza, where Israel is preparing to withdraw 5 combat units from the Gaza Strip. But it's not because the IDF is scaling back on its war against Hamas. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari told reporters, "The goals of the war require prolonged fighting, and we are preparing accordingly." Hagari also said the withdrawal allows active duty troops to resume training and for reserve troops to return to their full-time jobs until they are needed again. At the same time, the Gaza Health Ministry says recent intense fighting pushed the number of Palestinians killed in the last 3 months to more than 22,000, with 2.3 million people now homeless and in dire need of food, shelter, and water. In the world's other major conflict, 2,100 miles away, the Ukrainian state news agency says the country's defense minister wants to buy at least 1 million first-person view drones in 2024. This marks the country's first official purchase of the drones, which until now were bought by various lower-level groups. At the same time, a half-dozen additional Ukrainian fighter pilots began training to fly F-16s. A report in Defense One details the efforts to get Ukrainian pilots and ground crews up to speed on not only the jets that were donated, but also the language of their trainers. The half-dozen pilots enter a pipeline that's been training crews in England and Denmark since last August. Inadequate and outdated. A newly released report ordered by the Department of Defense takes aim at the military's ability to identify potential extremists in their ranks. Ordered in April of 2021 and completed in June of 2022, the report is just now being made available for public scrutiny, and that's only after repeated requests to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness for access. The report, ordered by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, is titled Study on Extremist Activity Within DoD Total Force. Authored by the Institute for Defense Analysis, it sheds little light on new issues that exist within the various branches of defense. Using previously collected data, the authors came to the conclusion there's little evidence to suggest the numbers of violent extremists in uniform is growing. But the report did find some evidence to suggest that may be true among former service members. The report also recommends the various service branches update how they issue security clearances to members, DoD employees, and contracted workers. The current process still relies on ideologies from the Cold War and War on Terror. Oops, they leaked it again. Fans of the video game War Thunder once again posted sensitive or classified documents to an online forum dedicated to the game called Machinery of War. This is the 14th time something like this has happened. The most recent leak took place in early December and included details about the U.S. Army's Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. The documents were taken down shortly after being posted, but not before some users were able to download them. The documents were from technical manuals and detailed the commander's hatch on the Bradleys. In 2021, the game's developers, Gaijin Entertainment, said it was aware of previous leaks and made it clear the company was not interested in any information unless it was declassified and publicly available. One of the U.S. Army's biggest workhorses is going to have its numbers thinned. General Michael McCurry says 157 Blackhawks, or about 8% of the Army's fleet, will be decommissioned as the branch readies for the aircraft's eventual replacement. In service since 1979, the UH-60 is being replaced by the Bell Textron V-280 Valor. You can find our story on the tiltrotor at straightarrownews.com. The Blackhawk reduction probably won't be obvious to most, as the Army is keeping around 2,000 vehicles in the mix. General McCurry says the Blackhawks being pulled from service are the oldest in the fleet and generally only flown if needed. Over the last 4 decades, the UH-60 airframe had several uses. Everything from medevac and search and rescue to transport and attack. Once decommissioned, the surplus UH-60s will be sold to allied nations at the bargain shopper price of just $2 million per unit. The U.S. Navy had a little something extra under the tree this year. On December 20th, Boeing delivered the first of 6 underwater drones. Called the Orca Extra Large Unmanned Undersea Vehicle, it's basically a drone submarine. The uncrewed submersible is part of the Navy's long-range plans to increase the size of its unmanned fleet. Depending on its configuration, the Orca measures between 51 and 85 feet. It's modeled after Boeing's Echo Voyager proof-of-concept vehicle, which underwent more than 10,000 hours of testing at sea. The Orca itself was put through rigorous testing above and below the surface. Its modular construction will allow operators to send it out in various configurations and with different payloads to different parts of the world, not only unmanned, but independent of support ships as well.
Tonight, you will be the victim of a nuclear attack by the Russians. Half an hour after this sneak attack, America will be on its knees.
If you grew up in the Cold War era, the threat of nuclear bombs and radioactive fallout were probably an accepted part of life. Something you knew was possible, even if unlikely to ever happen. While many of those threats ended with the thawing of US and Russian relations in the 90s, the danger is very much still there. Only now, it could also be in the hands of much smaller players, less predictable enemies. It's a concern that has the U.S. Department of Defense turning to my alma mater, the University of Nebraska, to find an answer for a problem with which they hope they never have to deal.
Okay, elevated readings. What are your readings then?
For many folks, maybe most, the thought of a dirty bomb sounds like something straight out of a Tom Clancy novel, which it is. But it's also something that, in the hands of the wrong people, poses a very real threat to not only Americans, but places of American interest all across the globe. Mix in the potential for a nuclear accident or a nuclear weapons incident, and you have the need for something that can protect those whose job is defined by heading straight into harm's way.
When you think about the threats that our military personnel could face anywhere around the world in any scenario, and we have a very interesting world around us, whether it's Ukraine, the Middle East, whatever it is, we have to be thinking about the threats that could be coming down the road in the future, along with today's threats. And so one of the things that is out there is potential exposure to radiation.
That's where the work of some very talented people at the University of Nebraska and the University of Nebraska Medical Center comes in. They are part of a collaborative effort with the National Strategic Research Institute, or NSRI, to create a medicine that would prevent or at least reduce the effects of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. Symptoms of ARS include all the classics: burning sensations on the skin, diarrhea, maybe death. And the threat is far more than hypothetical. In October, a Houston police officer carrying something similar to a Geiger counter found some cesium-137, a radioactive material that was improperly disposed of in a Houston scrapyard, leaving key ingredients to a dirty bomb just lying around is the kind of mistake that would lead to a very big problem if the wrong people found out, especially in large metropolitan areas.
If they're going to go in harm's way, if they're going to go into a situation where there's radioactivity, they could take this drug and be protected in part from the radiation exposure.
So when the government looked at that problem in there, how do we protect service members we might put into harm's way from exposure to a threat, in this case radiation, and allow them to accomplish their mission and then come home to their families? So this type of project is really focused on protecting our service members from a threat that they could be exposed to on a really bad day.
In September of 2023, the Defense Health Agency awarded a $24.5 million contract to NSRI, the DoD University-affiliated Research Center of U.S. Strategic Command, and the University of Nebraska system.
I usually phrase it as that, we are trying to use our research to be able to protect from damage due to radiation. And so, that's in the context of being an accidental radiation exposure or having, some type of, military catastrophe. We're trying to make it so that we have things in place so that people can be protected if they have to go into a situation.
Cases are rare, but effects of ARS and its punishing aftermath can be found in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster in 1986. But there are more recent examples of potential dangers. Last October, for instance, Russia's defense minister told his counterparts in the UK, France, and the US that he believed Ukraine could be prepping a dirty bomb for use against Russia. Ukraine responded by calling the allegations transparently false. But it is the kind of situation that makes people stop and think, what if? That's why, in part, the research team in Nebraska turned to Dr. Tomas Helikar and his use of computational systems biology, essentially using a digital patient in place of a real one.
I wanted to be a scientist to make a difference, and this project enables me to do that because we're going from, in our case, from computer models all the way, hopefully, to use of the medications that we develop by soldiers. Being able to contribute to a project that has this translational impact in my lifetime. I don't have to wait 20 years for somebody to discover our science and do something with it. We will be able to, at this university, we'll be able to, and the university system will be able to really scale that up and apply that to other diseases.
While the Defense Health Agency is looking out primarily for those service members who would be in harm's way, the research will yield benefits for civilians as well.
Anything that we can do in our lab to help make somebody's life better is a win for me, and so that's our goal as researchers. And so, if we can help, protect our military servicemen, that is wonderful. If we can help protect cancer patients, that's wonderful. So we're really that's why I'm in this business, is because I want to help people and use our knowledge on the science to be able to make other people's lives better in the future.
For those involved, the collaborative nature of the work is a huge motivating factor as they continue to put the pieces in place that they hope will one day protect service members and patients alike.
Fundamentally, I think as Midwesterners, we just collaborate well. We work well together. I think what we're offering and what we've developed honestly could have been developed at a lot of other institutions. What makes us unique is that we brought all this talent together to a common mission.
Together we can do much bigger science than alone. And we have about half of our researchers in Lincoln and half in Omaha. We meet regularly. Samples get passed back and forth. Students work together. It's powerful, powerful.
I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the scientists and researchers at the University of Nebraska for helping me bring you this story. For more on this, please head over to san.com. Tanks, landmines, artillery barrages. The ground offensive in Ukraine's war is as visually striking as it is horrific. But it's not the only way Russia and Vladimir Putin are fighting Ukraine. They're also trying to choke off the country's grain exports in the Black Sea, a devastating move for potentially millions around the globe. In just the past few months, Ukraine says sea mines placed in shipping lanes by the Russians damaged at least 3 ships and maybe as many as 9. Enter the navies of the United Kingdom and Norway with the Maritime Capability Coalition. The British government says it plans to provide Ukraine with 2 Royal Navy ships, specifically 2 Sandown-class mine hunters. According to the British Ministry of Defense, these fiberglass vessels are nearly 174 feet long and operate as single-role mine hunters rather than mine sweepers. Basically, what that means is these ships seek, detect, and destroy individual naval mines, whereas minesweepers clear entire areas without prior detection of mines. Built and designed by British shipbuilder Vosper Thornycroft, only 15 Sandowns were ever made. The first entered service in 1989. With a 35-man crew, these ships can cruise at a top speed of 13 knots, or about 15 miles an hour for you land lovers out there. While these ships are armed with 6 guns, they're mostly for self-defense. There's a 30mm rapid-fire cannon along with 3 Browning 50 caliber miniguns and 2 general-purpose machine guns. But the real star of the operation is the Seafox Mine Disposal Unmanned Underwater Vehicle System, or UUV. Made by Atlas Electronic, the Seafox is the underwater drone doing much of the sniffing out and destroying for the Sandowns. But that's not the only role for these cunning creatures. Seafoxes can also be used for surveillance, enabling Ukrainian sailors to survey Russia's strategic ports and submarine routes. The promise of the new SeaTech comes at a time when Russia's losses in the Black Sea are also mounting. From the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 through November of 23, at least 17 Russian vessels were struck. Most will never sail again. Unfortunately, though, just because Britain wants to give Ukraine the ships doesn't mean Ukraine can actually get them. Turkey is dragging its heels on letting the vessels pass through the Bosphorus Strait. Turkey says it wants to keep the strait from becoming a part of the theater of war. Well, this is not great news for Ukraine. It also means Russia can't sail any warships through the strait either. All right, folks, it's time in the show that we call Comms Check, and it's an opportunity for us to kind of check in with you, the audience, and see where your head's at, if you have any questions on any of the content that we've put out. Now, this being the inaugural episode of Weapons and Warfare, there's not a whole lot of social media just yet, or comments on our social media just yet for us to peruse from. So we pulled some comments from some stories that I've done for Straight Arrow News. The very first comment that we have, the very first comms check on Weapons and Warfare, is for a story that we did back in November, and it's a story about the U.S. Navy testing using unmanned surface vessels, basically drone boats, launching unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. So drone boats launching aerial drones as a new form of combat. And this is all in a move to sort of counter the next near-peer adversary, China, and the People's Liberation Army Navy, which is the official name of the Chinese Navy. Well, the first question, the first comment, comes from Roland Rosenberg, and I said that the Chinese Navy, the PLAN, is the world's largest navy in terms of number of hulls. Mr. Roland Rosenberg said that was entirely false, and wanted me to take a look at the number of aircraft carriers and the number of destroyers. Well, Mr. Rosenberg, good for you. I have some information to hit you with. So when you talk about aircraft carriers, you're absolutely right. The U.S. Navy does have more aircraft carriers than any other nation on the planet, with 11 aircraft carriers. And each one of these aircraft carriers has the potential to topple nations. You can't really undersell the amount of technology and weaponry on each one of these carriers. The People's Liberation Army Navy has 2 carriers. They are working on their third. It's undergoing, kind of the last round of testing right now, the electromagnetic launch system. So China has 2 carriers, soon to be 3. The U.S. has 11. You had mentioned destroyers, and again, the U.S. has far more destroyers, guided missile destroyers, which are kind of the bodyguards of aircraft carriers. Guided missile destroyers are just wreaking havoc on all of the Houthi rebel weaponry that's being launched in the Red Sea right now. But the U.S. has 92 destroyers, China has 50. However, when you start talking about corvettes and frigates and other smaller vessels, this is where the Chinese Navy really kind of surpasses the U.S. They have more frigates than the U.S. In terms of corvettes. The United States has 22, and China has 72. In terms of submarines, the United States has 68 to China's 78. Now, Mr. Rosenberg, I'm sure you will also bring up the point that it's not just about the number of boats, because the PLAN labels pretty much any kind of vessel with a weapon as a Navy vessel. The U.S. Navy has a little bit of a higher threshold to meet in order for it to be classified as a Navy vessel. However, the PLAN weaponry on their vast number of vessels has developed over the years. The U.S. it's not living in a vacuum. China has made it a sole purpose to match the U.S. economically and militarily. And so that means they've developed their rocket force, is what it's called in China, to a point that it's concerning enough for the U.S. Navy that they want to disperse their forces, distribute their forces. The Air Force is doing the same thing because there's enough concern over China's missile technology that, you know, 1 or 2 missiles can take out an aircraft carrier, and you don't need a giant boat to launch these missiles. So China can field a number of these smaller vessels, each one carrying a handful of these aircraft killer missiles, and then there's real cause for concern for the U.S. Navy, which is why they're doing this force distribution posture. But, Mr. Rosenberg, to your original question, the PLAN is the world's largest Navy. The U.S. Navy is like 4th or 5th largest Navy in the world, depending on how you want to count the ships. In terms of military might, though, you would be hard-pressed to find any Navy that could go toe-to-toe with the U.S. Navy, Mr. Rosenberg. I think you and I could both agree on that. Which brings us to our next comms check, and this is on a story about Ukraine funding and the U.S. funding running out. And our question comes from, love this name, Twansicle. It's going to take some getting used to on my part as host of the show to read out some of these screen names. So thank you, Twansicle, for having that screen name and for your question of why doesn't Europe cough up more money, or some money? Why doesn't Europe cough up some money? All right. So to answer your question, Twansicle, if I'm reading it correctly, you are implying that the U.S. is giving more than any other country, and that Europe is not really participating in helping out the Ukrainians fight their war against Russian aggression. However, Twansicle, I can happily say to you that the U.S. is not the only ones paying or donating weapons, supplies, or money to Ukraine. In fact, if you want to, Twansicle, you can go to a handy-dandy site called the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And the folks at Kiel have done a great job of compiling all of the donations to Ukraine. And the data is accurate up and through October of 2023. So not right up to date, but still pretty accurate. And it's in euros. So you might have to do some conversion on another platform if you want to take a look at that. However, based on the Kiel Institute numbers, again, accurate up through October, the U.S. had spent 78 billion euros, both in weapons donations and in straight humanitarian aid and money to help keep some of the infrastructure going in Ukraine. $78 billion for the U.S. The EU, European Union, had, 78 billion euros. The EU paid 93 billion euros. So a little bit more than the United States. However, I'm sure, Twansicle, you will also bring up the point that it's not a straight apples-to-apples comparison, because the United States is one nation, the European Union is a multitude of nations gathered together. So let's break it down a little bit further into GDP. And again, the Kiel Institute folks have a great map put together where you can click on the different countries and find out exactly how each country's GDP, or gross domestic product, which is the accumulation of all the goods and services that a country produces, how much of that as a percentage is going to Ukraine. If you look at the United States, you will see that while the total commitments is number one, go USA, by GDP, the U.S. is not first, second, third, fourth, fifth, not even in the top 10. In terms of GDP, the U.S. ranks 15th for aid sent to Ukraine. Over in Europe, you will find Norway, which is 4th in total commitments, but actually 1st in GDP with a rank of 1.596 to the US's 0.32%. So, Twansicle, good news is that the U.S. is not the only country giving money or aid to Ukraine. Europe is absolutely too. In fact, the last few months of 2023 saw Germany kind of stepping into that second place role as the next best benefactor to Ukraine other than the United States. However, that money is dwindling, and so we will see where that funding goes from here. All right, folks, we're nearing the end of our first episode of Weapons and Warfare, but we have one last segment, and as the fancy title slate indicates, it's a time dedicated to sort of letting me rant for a bit about topics that catch our eye or we feel need to be addressed in a little bit different format. So let me go on record right from the start and say Ryan's Raps will feature commentary. Mostly it's going to be mine, but I may lean on my colleagues here at the show from time to time as well, because, I mean, they're smart people too, right? So now, I want it to be very clear from the start. I am a journalist, and as such, it's very important personal, political, or social biases don't make it into our segments dedicated to journalistic reporting. But on this segment, you will hear my thoughts. I will tell you what I think and explain how I arrived at that conclusion. If I get new information or insights and maybe need to correct myself, I reserve the right to do that. And honestly, that's one of the ways that we hope that we can earn your trust. We don't want to be wrong. Let's face it. We don't want to be wrong. But if it happens, we'll admit it and we'll adjust as necessary. So, why should you listen to me, another bald white dude, do a show called Weapons and Warfare? Well, I've been a journalist now for about 2 decades, and as sad as it may be for the industry, that's kind of a decent run by today's standards. I won't go through every job that I've had or every stop that I've made along the way, but you can believe me when I say I've done a lot of military stories. I know the difference between a base and a post. I've participated in and I've covered live fire exercises. And you know, I was even covering the Pentagon's pivot to the Pacific, as they called it, back when there was just 1 or 2 Marvel movies. So that's me. That's who I am. As far as why we're doing a show about weapons and warfare, simply put, it matters. It matters a lot. The Department of Defense's budget for 2024 is more than $840 billion. Billion. And that's just what's budgeted. Last year, the United States spent more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. And thanks to world conditions being what they currently are, those next 10 countries are all planning to increase their own military budgets this year, next year, and probably for the foreseeable future. All of that, and we didn't even mention the fact that now drones worth a couple $100s are taking out multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment on modern battlefields. So yeah, it's a safe bet to say that somehow, some way, either directly or indirectly, weapons or warfare will impact your life, if they haven't already. Now, I'm not a fearmonger, and Weapons in Warfare will not be a show cheerleading death and destruction. What I am is a seasoned journalist, working with a team of dedicated individuals, and we have an opportunity, an awesome opportunity, to cover some of the most impactful stories of our time, and we recognize the responsibility as well. We hope to be engaging, and yes, keep your attention, but also we want to answer some of your questions. So hopefully that helps put into perspective who we are and what we're trying to do here with Weapons and Warfare. We have lots of great content planned for the episodes ahead, and we sure hope that you join us for that journey. We're going to play with the format here and there, and we're going to play with how we tell those stories. So, for senior producer Brett Baker, video editor Brian Spencer, and graphics designer Dakota Hitt, and the whole team at Straight Arrow News, I'm Ryan Robertson with Weapons and Warfare, signing off.